Once again, a very good afternoon. Ben Jacobs with you. It's day 2 of the SIGA Youth Forum. Thanks so much to everyone asking questions and engaging. It's brilliant to have so many attendees active over the course of yesterday and throughout today as well. And Stand With SIGA is the hashtag. Do also post a story on Instagram. It's what a lot of the under 30s use, and you can tag us and we'll give you 5 minutes of fame on our platform as well. In addition to that, I would like to point out that if you've missed any of the panels or interviews that we've done, remember there's those special sessions as well, including stuff on career advice as to how you can break into the industry if you're one of our younger viewers. You can find all of them over the course of the coming days on our YouTube page. But let's move on to our 3:30 panel now. It's called Human Rights, Creating Pressure on Sports Organisations to Reform Themselves. Our moderator is Fando Sebia. She is an ambassador for UATSG and also a freelance television presenter and journalist. You'll find her in a variety of different platforms, but Supersport is certainly one of them. And Ivana, Alison, Maureen and Anton are also part of this panel, and I'll let Fando introduce them in a little bit more detail now. Fando, great to have you with us. A very good afternoon, and it's over to you.
Good afternoon from France, Ben. It's a pleasure to be in the company of everyone who has joined us this afternoon. My name is Sebia, as Ben has introduced me very well and briefly. And I am South African, but I'm currently living in France. And I will be the moderator for today's discussion on human rights and creating pressure on sports organizations to reform themselves. Now, I wouldn't be able to sail this ship by myself. I have an amazing panel of experts from their respective disciplines weighing in on the topic of today's discussion. And without further ado, before introducing them, I'd actually like to just give you a brief background of why this topic is of such great interest to me and is so close to what I stand for in my principles. If you know about the history of South Africa and knowing that we're a very young democratic nation, in 1994, we had our very first democratic elections, and it was sports that played a very impactful role in applying pressure on international organizations and institutions towards the fight against apartheid and segregation. Prior to the 1994 elections, we were sanctioned and boycotted from various sporting events, and post 1994, in 1995, we hosted and won the very first Rugby World Cup hosted in South Africa. Now, this is very close to what I stand for because it speaks a lot to how sports played a very big role in advancing the important role of human rights. And also our president, our very first democratic president, may his soul rest well, President Nelson Mandela, said something very important about sport. And he said, sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. And it speaks to the youth in a language that they understand. Now, we have all gathered here today. Well, I'm guessing that most of you are part of the youth. And this is very important that we have come together today to plant seeds, to grow this tree that perhaps we might not be able to sit under the shade, but we are definitely playing an integral role in making the necessary change towards the realm of sport. Now, without speaking any further, I did say earlier on that I have an amazing panel of experts, and I'm going to introduce the very first speaker today, and she is Alison Bosco, and she is currently joining us all the way from Switzerland. Alison joined CSHR's parent organization, the International Human Rights and Business Organization, in June 2017 and supported the process that led to the creation of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, which is CSHR, in 2018. As manager of programs and partnerships, Alison works on a wide range of projects, including developing tools and guidance to support key stakeholders in implementing human rights, managing CSHR's work programs on mega sporting events and engagement with corporates, and supporting CSHR's outreach with sport federations. Prior to CSHR, Alison worked for 3.5 years at the United Nations supported Principles for Responsible Investment, where she worked with investors on managing their environmental, social, and governance, which is ESG risks. She holds an MSCI in International Relations from the University of Nottingham and also attended the Institut d'études politiques, which is Sciences Po in Paris. Without further ado, it brings me immense pleasure to welcome you, Miss Alison Bosco. Ça va là-bas?
Thank you, Fando, for the great introduction. Well, just by way of introducing myself and my background a little bit more. As Fando mentioned, I come from more of a business background. As she mentioned, my previous jobs have looked at integrating, various types of sustainability objectives into investment decision making. And separately to that, in what now feels like somewhat of a former life, I was also a competitive figure skater when I was a child and into my teenage years. And when I stopped skating, I began coaching. I got my coaching qualification and did that as a part-time job throughout high school and university. So I won't claim to have achieved quite the same accolades as some of the other speakers at this forum, but I do have a bit of a sporting background as well. So when the parent organization of the center, the organization that incubated the center, was looking for support on a work stream they were building on basically applying business and human rights principles to the world of sport, that was obviously the perfect marriage of my two areas of interest. And from there, I obviously worked very closely with a few colleagues to create what is now the Center for Sport and Human Rights. We define ourselves as a human rights organization for the world of sport. So basically, we try and take human rights principles, standards, concepts, and apply them in a way that's a little bit more relevant and a little bit more accessible to sports. So obviously I can talk a lot more about the process to create the center and the work that we do, but for the purposes of introduction, I will stop there and hand it back to you, Fando. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I have a brief background in international relations myself. And so I'm actually very interested in hearing how you're going to merge the two, considering humanities and merging it with sports. As you said, you're trying to one of the objectives of the CSHR is to kind of modify the way we understand and simplify the way we understand human rights and sport. So I'm looking forward to your inputs in that regard. I'm going to move on to our second speaker today. And this young lady, I had the pleasure of working alongside at the African Sports Venture Group, where we were discussing the future of sport in Africa in a post-COVID-19 environment. Plenty was discussed. And so I'm very interested to see how she's going to build from that, because the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of shifted and shook the world of sport beyond just the world at large. And so I think each discussion that we have, we're all working towards finding solutions towards seeing how this new norm is going to pan out. It's currently underway. We're seeing a lot of sporting events taking place behind closed doors. Is this a new normal that we're going to have to get used to? Supporters, the communities that it affects. And this is kind of topics that are going to be paramount to today's discussion in understanding the impact of human rights in sport and how organizations can work together towards reforming themselves in this current situation. I did mention earlier on that I do have a very interesting young lady who's joining us today, Miss Maureen Rosita Ojong Ebob Besson, joining us all the way from Senegal. Now, Miss Maureen is a sports and development specialist and a social entrepreneur. She currently serves the SEED, which stands for Sport for Education and Economic Development Project, as program director, playing a role in support, implementation, and monitoring of SEED programming in Senegal and Africa. Founded in 1998, the SEED project is a 501c3 American NGO based in Senegal that uses sports, particularly basketball, as a hook to engage more youth in education and leadership development programs. Maureen boasts a number of domains of practice in human resource management, marketing, communications, sports administration, and nonprofit management. She has worked and consulted with organizations such as the UNDP and UNESCO in Gabon, Gabon's national oil company called Société Nationale des Hydrocarbures du Gabon, the International School of Gabon, JTC Consulting, Cameroon's Basketball Federation, Olim Africa International Foundation, and one of the regional basketball leagues in Gabon, Ligue de l'Estuaire. Maureen Rosita is a firm believer in the power of sport in empowering youth and shaping communities positively. She holds a BSc in Public Administrative Law from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, an MSc in International Business Management from the University of Derby in the United Kingdom. She also is a mentee under the SIGA Global Mentorship Program for young female leaders in sport, and is currently completing her second year towards obtaining an MBA in sports management through ISM, ESG, Dakar, and Paris. It is an absolute pleasure. Bienvenue et bon après-midi, Maureen. Ça va là-bas?
Oui, ça va très bien. Merci, Fando. Thank you very much, Fando. I'm actually blushing. Thank you for the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Happy New Year to all our audiences, all young sports leaders and executives watching us from around the world. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel of distinct, young leaders to share my views on human rights in sports and through sports. A very, very big thank you to the Sports Integrity Global Alliance, SIGA, for the opportunity. As Sebia rightfully mentioned, I am Maureen Rosita Ojong Ebubisong, an African woman, proudly representing Cameroon, which is my country of origin, Gabon, my country of adoption, and Senegal, my new home, where I serve, as program director for the SEED project, which, Sebia really perfectly presented. I would just like to add that, SEED is an organization that uses the platform of sports education, using education through the platform of sports, to empower, to inspire, and equip young people in Africa with tools to become responsible leaders in their communities. Our organization was created in 1998, as you rightfully mentioned, Sebia, by someone who we love to call the godfather of African basketball, Mr. Madu Galofal, following his personal experience of what, the role that sports can play in empowering an individual, and his desire to give back to his community and to enable youth from every social background in Africa to have access to better opportunities and in the future play their own role in developing the continent. I feel that I'm here today because a greater part of it is because of what sports has done to my life. As Alison mentioned, myself in her life, I also played sports at a very young age. It equipped me with key values. It's really helped to get me to where I am today. And I hope that this will be an opportunity for us to really share our views of what sports can do for citizens of a community and how it could promote human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for that lovely introduction. I'm very excited to hear your perspective on bringing in the youth and educating the youth on human rights using sport as a conduit. Now I'm going to be moving on to our third speaker, Miss Ivana Pranjic, and she is joining us all the way from Vienna in Austria. Now, Ivana is a former basketball player who has experienced the power of sport at a very young age. As a former war refugee, she found a new home in Austria, where she is currently residing, where she completed her master's degree in German and Slavic languages at the University of Vienna. Moreover, she finished her studies in sports science and management. Her previous work experience includes working at the EUSA University Games and being media manager of the Austrian Basketball Federation and UEFA Euro Spectator Communications. Ivana is currently involved in the #NewLeaders project from the IOC and EOC, which is the International and European Olympic Committee, respectively, and the Sports Diplomacy Academy. She is an ENGSO Youth Committee member representing Austria. She is an aspiring PhD candidate in the field of sports diplomacy, sport for development, and international relations. So it gives me immense pleasure to be virtually rubbing shoulders with you, Miss Ivana, and I am keen to learn about your experience as a former basketball player, as well as a refugee. This is also quite close to the discussion that we have today, considering human rights, because that is how we find a lot of players who represent a lot of countries that they weren't necessarily born in. So how do we then safeguard their human rights? But that is a discussion for later on after the introductions. Welcome and good afternoon to you, Ivana.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your kind words and the introduction. Thank you, Siga, for having me and for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to a great discussion and sharing my views and listening to the others regarding this very important topic. You previously mentioned and started with the words of Nelson Mandela. Well, as with your introduction, you have heard that sport has done a lot to my life. It helped me feel part of society. It helped me feel strong. It helped me also feel safe. And a long time I did not believe that I will end up back in the field that gave me so much, but here I am, and I'm very happy to be here and sharing my thoughts, views, and also my experience with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ivana. I look forward to hearing your inputs with regards to the current discussion on human rights and creating sports on organizations to reform themselves. Now, our final speaker today is Mr. Anton Klischowski, who is joining us from Berlin in Germany. Anton holds an MSc in Administration and Management of Professional Sports Clubs from the University of Bordeaux, so salut les Français, and a Bachelor of Arts in Sport Management from the University of Potsdam, and is currently working as a sports and sustainability consultant for initiatives such as Sports Trades Fair and the Berlin-based football club FC International 1980. He is also the founder of Project Pressful, a youth-led research initiative advocating for concrete human rights legislation in the sports industry. This expertise is complemented by his prior work experience at the European Football for Development Network, AIM Sport, Sticker Stars, Speed 4, and through several years of community service involvement in his hometown football club. Pressful has the mission to research in field of sports and human rights and to get in touch with youth to interest them in the topic of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome our fourth and final speaker in today's discussion, Mr. Anton.
Yeah, thank you very much again for these kind words. I'm also looking forward to a fruitful discussion with all of you. I firstly actually touched the topic of sports and human rights during my master because I conducted research in the field of sport and corporate social responsibility. So this was my initiation. And then last year, in the light of a global design challenge that was online, I created the Project Pressful. As you mentioned perfectly, it's a research initiative gathering around the youth around the topic for sports and human rights, because I feel like sports actually advertises a lot of fair play, but I don't see this fair play outside of the pitch. And so I want to advocate and bring this topic also more in the interest of youth. And apart from this, I keep it short. I did some freelance work in this field also last year. I, for example, did German radio broadcasting, introducing the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights in the sporting context. I think we will touch upon this later. And yeah, I'm also actively working in the my club FC Internationale because we want to bring in sustainable textiles, so fair trade labels into our sporting clothes and into the whole club. So we also look at the supply chain in sports and in the world more deeper. So now I'm happy to bring all these discussions to the Youth Forum, and I hand back to you, Fando. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anton. Now, without further ado, it is time for us to delve into the discussion. I will repeat today's topic, and I'll probably say it many times so that you cannot forget. Today's discussion is human rights and creating pressure on sports organizations to reform themselves. Ms. Alison, I'm going to start with you. You work for the CSHR, which stands for Center for Sports and Human Rights. Now, I think it's paramount to today's discussion towards delving deeper into what is sports in human rights.
Oh, unmute. Thank you. So I mean, first of all, I wanted to start by sort of emphasizing when we talk about sport and human rights, and then I know that we have a few sport for development experts on the panel, and I'm sure also in the audience. So these two terms, they're sometimes used interchangeably, not always clear what the difference is, but I think the distinction is important to make. And so At the center, we would conceptualize human rights as being more sort of foundational, right? This is about risk management and mitigation. Sport and human rights is ultimately an approach. And the first step in that approach is recognizing that sport has an obligation to ensure that people who participate or interact with sport are not negatively affected in any way. Whereas when we look at, sport for development and the Sustainable Development Goals, these are more, aspirational. It's about positive development, transformative change, the positive power of sport, which we hear a lot and which we've already heard some great examples of. And the reason why I wanted to make this distinction is because, obviously, having worked in this space for a few years now, conversations around human rights are not always the nicest. They're not always the easiest conversations to have. When we're talking about human rights harms in sport, the unfortunately well-known examples include things like the Larry Nassar abuse scandal in gymnastics. It includes things like the labor rights issues of construction workers building stadiums in Qatar. Just last week, we saw Belarus being stripped of its right to co-host the Ice Hockey World Championships. So yeah, these aren't always necessarily the most positive stories, but I nevertheless wanted to mention it because when it comes to the title of this session, which you helpfully reminded everyone of again, on using human rights to create pressure on sports bodies, I think this distinction is important, because if we want to create that pressure, then we need to talk about human rights. Because we need to, first of all, understand and accept that harms can and unfortunately have occurred. And therefore, we need to get the basics of prevention right. And it's our belief that a human rights-based approach can support sport in doing that. So what are we actually talking about then when we talk about human rights? I won't get too technical, but this includes things and concepts that we've all heard of, things like freedom from discrimination, freedom of expression, right to equal pay for equal work, things like this, right? And when we think about how does this relate to sport, we can obviously think of some examples. If you're taking freedom from discrimination, this could be fans who are concerned about being stigmatized or assaulted or harassed because of maybe their sexual orientation. This could be the efforts of football clubs and other sports to put an end to racist chants in stadia. If we look at freedom of expression, this could be journalists and broadcasters being free to report on what they feel is relevant and interesting when covering a sporting event. It could also be athletes speaking out on causes that they believe in, like we saw many examples of, last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. And yeah, so there's lots of examples, I think, of where human rights intersect with sport. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, at the center, we try and merge these two areas together a little bit. We've obviously developed many tools and guides which we hope support that process. And ultimately, our aims and our objectives is, first and foremost, to prevent any harms from happening. Secondly, if and when harms do occur, to support access to remedy. So in other words, sort of trying to make right what's gone wrong. And then the third layer is what I mentioned, that more aspirational layer of promoting a positive human rights legacy. So yeah, I can go into detail on any of that, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think that was a perfect way to start the discussion in creating that distinction and better understanding the distinction between the aspirational, which is sport for development, and human rights, which is the foundation of the discussion right now. So you touched on a number of topics that I think are really important and can actually help us branch out into the discussion a lot easier today. You made a couple of examples. Just yesterday, we had some racial slurs that were exchanged, well, not necessarily exchanged, they were more so one-directional towards a few Manchester United players after the loss against Sheffield yesterday. And in looking at the current situation, with the digital changes that are taking place right now, I see we have the industrial revolution, where we're seeing a lot more participation on the digital platforms, and with supporters not necessarily being in stadiums, or in stadia rather. We've seen a lot of organizations advocating for movements against racism, but it more so relating to supporters at the stadium. And now we're seeing another kind of disease, if I can say, for lack of a better word, coming through, and with this anonymity on social media platforms, where you'll have racial slurs exchanged towards players, and which is going to be a little bit difficult to tackle for sports organizations, which we're here to discuss, and how to create pressure on them. But I'm actually going to lean more towards the aspirational topic that you brought up, and I'm going to direct this question to Maureen. You have a background in sports administration and sports for development, working closely with the SEED project towards educating the youth on matters such as human rights. Can you just unpack that a little bit more in terms of how projects such as the SEED project aim to inform and create awareness around human rights?
Thank you very much, Sebia, for the floor, and thank Alison for really clearly, bringing up those instances. I think that first of all, on a grassroots level, for grassroots sports organizations, it's really on two levels. And I think Alison, first of all, brought up one, which is in sports, really ensuring that we create programs that target key human rights issues like gender equality, like integration of socially disfavored groups, ensuring that young people have equal access to sports, which today, in terms of human rights, it's a real issue in some communities. There are communities around the world and on the continent where young people are still unable to access sports safely, which is a fundamental part of their human rights. So I think that sports, grassroots sports organizations like the one I work for and many others have a very capital role in, remedying that. You also have, with regards to human rights in sports organization and grassroots levels, which goes beyond actually even teaching young people, is for them to see real-time examples in the organizations that create programs for them. And this brings me to a subject of how, employees are treated in organizations, be it on the level of international organizations or even grassroots. Are fair conditions created for people to be able to exercise the jobs that they like? Are the fair conditions created for people to be able to equip the beneficiaries with the tools they need? The other level, I believe, is really about identifying the key causes that these organizations are out to defend. On the grassroots level and sports for development side, we see that a lot of sports for development organizations are there to, defend gender equality, are there to promote the rights of disabled youth. And I think that it's really about, giving them more and more that platform to actively defend these causes, use their platforms to speak out. You guys rightfully brought up the subject of using sports as a platform to throw light on racism, on key human rights abuse cases in society. And I think that throughout the past months, we've seen how much sports can play a role in actually throwing light on the promotion of rights, of human rights around the globe. But I also really want to say, Sebia, that one of the things I really want to throw light on, which I think that is really capital with regards to youth, because they are the future athletes, they are the future leaders of our community, is to, touch on the rights of freedom of speech. Today, there's that argument of if sports, and politics are supposed to be meddled with. And as we all know, human rights abuse cases in most organizations and countries have been linked to social and political factors. I think that we can agree that, sociopolitics is taken into consideration in the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's my opinion that, sports, politics and human rights should not be separated, and that if sports is a tool for sustainable development and peace around the world, then every human being, be they sports or non-sports men or women, should have the right to respectfully and non-violently, you know, exercise their civil and political rights as highlighted in Article 3, 18 and 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I believe that sports organizations have the power to influence a shift, with regards to the respects of human rights around the world by putting pressure on governments and international organizations to implement policies to respect and protect the rights of citizens. And I also want to just conclude by saying that, it's fair to say that, considerable efforts are being made. We've seen that through the Olympic Charter, which has been, used to throw light on human rights abuse during the 2014 Winter Olympics that took place in Sochi, where migrant workers stayed for months unpaid, and thanks to the collaboration between the ILO and the IOC, this migrant workers got back their dues. I think that in terms of just for sports for development organizations navigating through the COVID-19 period, it will be important for sports for development organizations to come up with safety and health standards and related protocols for sports persons, staffs, and athletes as a priority in the world of work, because COVID-19 has definitely not only impacted sports organizations financially, but has also had a direct impact on the lives of workers in the sports environment. People have lost their lives, families have been touched in different level. And even COVID-19 has especially had an impact on young people's access to sports programs. So I think that if the different actors in the sports world and the sports for development will come together to really create those policies and support each other, a lot more can be done with regards to human rights. But as it is right now, there is still so much work to be done, be it on the grassroots levels, be on the level of policies, be it on the political levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I think you brought up a number of topics or a number of matters that have stood out. I think one that has stood out and will actually help me direct the next question to Ivana is that relating to the participation of youth and children in sports right now. I think youth and children have been the hardest hit in terms of the pandemic, with the halting of sports events and sporting programs due to the coronavirus pandemic. So Ivana, I'm going to pose this question to you, considering your involvement in the IOC and EOC leadership program and advocating for equality at the IOC conference. Right now, things are very unequal and imbalanced for a lot of people, especially considering the lack of participation from youth and children. From a youth perspective, considering your role as well as a youth member in the youth committee, what can and should sports organizations do to protect and uphold the basic human rights of those involved at every level of the sports landscape? I'm speaking from the participants, which is the youth and children, the coaches who are now finding themselves idle, to the administrators who are used to facilitating such programs at each and every single level. What is it that you think that sports organizations can and should do?
Question, and thank you very much for the great input from Alison and Maureen. Well, as you've said, I'm part of ENGSO Youth, the European non-governmental sports organization, and we use sport as a tool for social change. And the current youth generation is considered the biggest we have ever had in the world. And from a youth perspective, and as a youth leader and somebody that is trying to give the youth a real say, especially in sport. I mean, sport is part of society. And I want to first point out that sport is not only as it is part of society, it has the good and the bad. It can save us, but it can also bring us to the other perspective. So when we speak about it, we really have to keep that in mind. But for young people, as speaking from my personal experience, sport, most of the time, or when we start doing sports, it has a great impact on our lives. It makes us strong. It helps us with different problems. It helps us create It helps us to create togetherness. It helps us to be part of society or of a circle. So in terms of equality within youth, and also I want to add here the point of women, because this is a very important topic to my very close to my heart. As simple as it is, equality is a human right, and we all know that, and that's why we are gathering here, and we therefore must ensure that all human beings are able to fully develop and use their human rights, be it talent, conscious, intelligence. And in terms of youth, youth is often considered as not being experienced enough, not maybe having enough knowledge, and not having the education. And from a perspective of a big European organization voting and standing for youth rights, we really try to shift that paradigm to able youth, to intelligent youth, that we have on the one hand the on-field experience in practice, where we are together with other young people. We see the problem. We are maybe part of the problem. Maybe we are already helping solving the problem. And with that experience, we can go to the next level and advocate, because we also, on the other hand, we have education. We are young academic people. And if we are not, we are trying to put that experience we're having together. And from a perspective of youth, I really see the most important, not just in youth, but also in the context of sport and human rights, that we need a shift in paradigm. And I think it is slowly happening. We see that the sport for development, sport and human rights sector is growing. But first of all, we need to change the mindset before we can change the rules and before we can change the law. And I think we're still on that first level, but we are making progress. And I'm really happy to be amongst great panelists that are helping making that shift and leading that change.
Thank you so much, Ivana, for that point. I think one thing that stands out, not just for myself, but for a lot of people, was a paradigm shift. This is the most important thing, because times are changing. We cannot keep doing things the way we have been doing them traditionally, because things aren't operating or unfolding as they have been traditionally. So you mentioned something. We're all gathered here as academics, and I think one of the things that stands out for me is perhaps influencing the kind of content that is in the university's curricula, considering sports and humanities. Do we have enough courses such as these available to younger, at a lower level, perhaps at more of the bachelor level? But this is a point that we'll probably add on at another discussion, because I do see that we're quite pressed for time. So Anton, I have a question for you from Mr. Ganesan Ramanathan, who is the Football Development Officer for Sportseed Pro. And he wants to know, why are sports federations hesitant to resolve issues on human rights?
Well, it's a good question in general. Maybe before I answer to this one directly, I wanted to touch upon Ivana's and your point as well, Fando, that that we have to differentiate between the good and the bad side of sport, which is a very important topic to discuss, in my opinion, because we've heard the slogan of Nelson Mandela: sport has the power to change the world, and then for the better or for the worse. I know it's a provocative question, but I mean, we have to put a lot of work and a lot of commitment into this to ensure that sport is a fair place and a fair, it's open and inclusive to all. And I think this discussion, and this is my answer to this question specifically, is very difficult, because you have to get into a lot of perspectives. You have to do a lot of stakeholder consultations. You have to do a lot of research, because the world is changing very fast. We have a lot of diverse interests, a lot of diverse stakeholder sets in the world. And of course, it's difficult to confront them all. Of course, it's difficult to get in touch with them. But I think is something we have to do. This is the effort we have to do in order to ensure this sport we are craving for, this fair sport for all. Because currently, as I said before, I've seen this in slogans, I've seen this in marketing, I've seen this in a lot of high quality brochures, but I don't see it really on the pitch and in policies that we're discussing. And also what I wanted to add in this regard is that I think also we as fans, we also play a little part in this, because I think we should be a bit more critical, confronting our own sport. I give you one example that I have in mind in this, of which I thought about before this discussion. I don't know if you remember the story about Newcastle United, club of the Premier League. And yeah, there was a failed takeover of the Saudi Arabian investment fund, so directly related to the Saudi Arabian government. And this failed due to human rights concerns. So in this regard, first of all, the creating pressure on sports organization was positive, because the English Premier League actually had concerns about this takeover. But then we saw on digital and on social media that fans were actually advocating for the buy-in. So the fans put actually the profit over the people, you know. So they lacked this sort of distance. They lacked this sort of criticism of their own sport, because they think of their success first. And this is also something we want to change, maybe with our own project with Pressful, that we just give some other perspectives that have to be taken into consideration. Also, when we talk about the hosting of several international major sporting events that will be coming in the future. Alison, you mentioned the Qatar World Cup. We also have Beijing, the IOC World Games ahead of us. And yeah, of course, we can say in the Olympic Charter, we have a commitment to human rights, but this is apparently not enough if we don't even have an open discussion about why or if Beijing is like a hosting city that we can use for a major sporting event. So to keep it short, I think we need a proper discussion about this, and we need an open discussion about this. And I think then everyone, all the stakeholders, will also understand a way bit better what we are advocating for.
Very interesting points. You put it very well, Anton. Speaking of things like sport washing that has plagued the sports environment right now, we're even seeing it with broadcasting rights across several countries, where the public are not able to have access to key sporting events for the mere fact that they don't necessarily have the privilege to be able to pay certain fees to be able to watch certain sporting events. So these are the kinds of topics that I think we should be delving deeper into, and sports organizations definitely need to feel the pressure. Ms. Alison, I'm going to pose this final question to you before getting closing remarks from everyone. I cannot believe how fast time has gone by. I really wish we could continue the discussion, have lectures on it, because honestly, not much is going into having such discussions towards actually putting some impactful change. Perhaps it's due to the autonomy of sports and sports organizations not necessarily operating as states in terms of accountability and being able to be held accountable for the things that they are or are not necessarily doing. And so this final question is, how can organizations such as SIGA improve integrity on human rights?
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, I just wanted to quickly touch on something that Anton had said, which is, you know, I mentioned the example of you know, labor rights in Qatar, and an example of sport, I think, being a catalyst for actually good practice is, you know, there's been a lot of work that's gone on with that particular event. And you know, the situation has improved a lot. There have been policies and everything put in place. So I think what started as well, quite negative, has improved. And I think that wouldn't have happened if a country like that didn't have the World Cup. In terms of, you know, what SIGA and other organizations can do to continue, you know, increasing accountability and integrity. I mean, I think a big part of it is first of all, just, you know, continuing to raise the issues that come up. We can't obviously address these challenges if we don't know what the challenges are. So I think continuing to have forums, and, you know, to Ivana's point when she was talking about paradigm shifts, I think a big part of why this shift is happening is because there are more questions being asked, and that's not just from organizations like SIGA. It's from fans, as Anton mentioned. In many cases, it's from athletes themselves. We've seen them speaking out, and I think all of this, when it adds up, all together, is really powerful in forcing sports bodies to look at this. And as I mentioned in my opening, I've previously worked more with the corporate sector on this, and we've seen this in the corporate sector as well. As it starts with one entity sort of taking a bit of a leading role. Sometimes the corporates they implement policies because they feel like they have to, and then there's another conversation where they then move on to fully embedding it. But I think the ball is rolling, so to speak, and I think continuing to push is really the answer.
Thank you, Alison. I think that is one of the best ways we can say is continue applying pressure, because we cannot deny the fact that we have seen a lot of change over the past few years in the world of sport and in the world at large. So I do think that the strides might be small, but as I said at the start of the topic, is that we're planting seeds for a massive tree under which we might not sit and enjoy the shade, just like the ones who came before us planted these seeds, and we are currently sitting under the shade of inclusivity. Who would have thought that we would have 4 women having a discussion on the future of sports and human rights, and you'd have only 1 man part of the discussion? So this is showing that we are making the necessary strides, perhaps not as rapidly as we would like to see, but one step at a time. So I'd just like to get your closing remarks from each of the panelists or each of the speakers, starting with you, Mademoiselle Maureen. Can you just share with us your closing remark before we wrap up and hand over to our MC?
Yeah, I think I'll just, join what Alison said. I think that it's really a collective effort. It's not only organizations, as individuals, how we treat one another in our communities, how we interact with one another, in spite of our, colors, our ethnicities, our races. I think that when we talk about globalization and being citizens of the world, in quotes, it's also about respecting one another. And then we can talk about, the institutions, because it's also about culture. I think that human rights fundamentally in most societies and communities has been linked to, cultural practices. This community not agreeing that this other community is relevant, this race thinking that the other race is irrelevant, this gender thinking that this other gender is irrelevant. And we just have to start reasoning as human beings and understanding that we all need each other, to survive, to move forward. And especially for, organizations that deal with young people, I would like to see that we need to, when I say we, is really sports for development organizations and sports organizations working with young people. We need to invest more in ensuring that young people have access to safe sports, really an environment where they can safely learn, develop themselves without being abused, without being exposed to drugs, and just being able to, grow into the leaders that we want them to become tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. All the best in your MBA, and we look forward to seeing what kind of changes you will be making, because you are contributing significantly towards the change and growth of sport and youth development in Africa, and you might even see the ripple effects in the rest of the world. So thank you very much for your participation today, and all the best going forward. Ivana, would you like to give us your words of closing or word of thanks?
Thank you very much, Sebia. Yes, I will just touch upon my shift in paradigm. We have to transform the way we lead in order to get somewhere. From the bottom, from the top, the boardrooms, the CEOs, we really have to transform. But increasingly, we are already transforming because we have all the social movements that are happening from the bottom throughout society. And I believe that the solution exists. There's maybe sometimes will is still missing, but I'm pretty sure that change can happen, change will happen. And the only way this can happen is, I believe that the only way forward is together. The only way to good governance, equality, inclusivity, and so on is together. And just a short remark to the young people: if ever anybody tells you the future is yours, please tell them the future is now. Stand up, be brave, and trust yourself and believe in yourself. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ivana. All the best in your future endeavors. And like I said with Maureen, I really look forward to seeing the kind of impact that you're going to make on the world of sports, not only in Vienna, not only in Austria, but in the rest of the world. And we genuinely look forward to seeing the kinds of moves that you'll be making. Anton, would you like to give us your word of thanks for today before we wrap up and hand over to Alison?
Yeah, I keep it short and sweet, and I would say get used to more athlete activism. It will be the decade of athletes, and there will not be more shut up and dribble, as you might have heard from some TV reporters in the US. Yeah, because this is the most important stakeholder in the sports.
Thank you very much, Anton. Nice and short and sweet. Disrupt, disrupt, disrupt is what we have to do. Alison, would you like to give us your word of thanks?
Yeah, sure. I guess I would just close by saying, sometimes these conversations can be a little bit daunting, a little bit intimidating, but there are obviously organizations and people that are working in this space that are here to help. And yeah, just thank you very much to all of you and to SIGA for organizing, I think, probably the first all youth event, certainly that I've ever attended, which is great.
Thank you very much, Alison, Ivana, Maureen, Anton. Thank you very much to you for joining us at home. This has been the discussion on human rights and creating pressure on sports organizations to reform themselves. I hope that you have not only enjoyed this discussion, but have taken plenty from it, like myself, and perhaps the rest of the panelists and speakers that we have joined us today. A few takeaway points from today's discussion: paradigm shift, pressure, continued pressure, applying pressure on these organizations is how we're going to achieve this change. Collaboration is important because we cannot achieve this as individuals, as individual organizations, but if we join together, we can definitely get the change that we want to see. And as Anton put it very well as some speakers in the previous panels, they did say the competitive element that is presented and promoted in the culture of sport, which promotes and then harbors disruption, is exactly what we need. Responsible disruption is how we are going to achieve this pressure that we are aiming towards in applying on sports organizations to reform themselves. My name is Fando. It has been an absolute pleasure to have hosted you all in today's discussion. Thank you very much to SIGA and the partners who have come on board to forming this wonderful panel and a wonderful gathering for all youths to take part in conversations. And as I mentioned, and will continue to mention, we are planting seeds for a great tree under whose shade we may or may not sit. So the future is in your hands, as Ivana put it very well, and the future is now. Thank you very much.